is our duty to protect the land. It always has been.
This has been a really difficult week for Canadians. People having trouble getting to work, to school, or home.
The RCMP invaded a sovereign nation.
These activists may have the luxury of spending days at a time on a blockade, but they need to check their privilege.
All about environment. It's all about territory.
History was built on racism, and I'm done with that. So there is no reconciliation. So as long as our children are dying, our people are dying, our people are going homeless, our people are being subjugated to the point that they're turning on themselves.
There's a lot of more work to be done, and I have a few messages that I need to go back to the Prime Minister. I'll be reaching out to tonight and discussing with my cabinet about what the next steps are. They aren't easy. No one said they were. This isn't an issue. The underlying issues did not arise yesterday. They've been present in the case of this community for hundreds of years.
Just a small sample there of the diverse reactions this week to the ongoing battle over the coastal Gaslink pipeline. It's a dispute that started in northern BC and has since spread across the country. Supporters of the Wet'suwet'en cause have shut down rail lines and staged large protests in numerous cities. Many wondering what happens now. We do know it is time for the Sunday Scrum. Joining me today in Ottawa, freelance columnist Susan Riley. Good morning, Susan.
Morning, John.
Globe Mail columnist John Ibbotson. Hello, John.
Hello, John.
And in Toronto, journalist Tanya Talaga. Hello, Tanya.
Hi.
And Tasha Carradine, the CEO of Ellipsum Public Affairs. Hi, Tasha.
Hey, John.
All right, let's start with the situation that is still ongoing with what has been called in sort of shorthand a blockade. But nonetheless, people close enough to the tracks that CN and VIA have made a decision not to continue rail travel through much of this country. Let's look at the questions that are being asked around that and a potential solution to what is going on in this country right now. Susan, do you want to start us off?
Yeah, can I just start by touching on the breathtaking arrogance of Andrew Scheer? That clip you just played, people who have the luxury of being at a blockade, they should check their privilege. I mean, when is the last time this man has ever dealt with any Indigenous people or visited any Indigenous communities? I mean, stunning. Anyway, he's past, he's history. By contrast, I thought Mark Miller, Trudeau's Minister of Indigenous Services, struck the right note yesterday when he met with people at the Mohawk blockade near Belleville. I would counsel patience, face-to-face communication, displays of respect, as long as it's genuine. I think that's the only way that we're going to emerge from this. I would just add that I do think the federal government was late to this. They should have been there earlier, but I think they are pursuing the right course.
There are larger issues to examine in this as well, but let's, John, talk about the particular case of this barricade on the line and a possible resolution for it.
Yeah, so if we are confining ourselves strictly to the question of the barricade near Belleville, the danger here is that attitudes are going to harden and tensions are going to escalate with every passing day, because it is not just a case of First Nations protesters and their supporters on the blockade versus the federal government and the Ontario government and the Ontario Provincial Police. It is also a case of growing anger in Quebec. The Legault government has demanded actions. There is the real possibility that we're going to start seeing layoffs this week as CN shuts down its eastern operations. The economic impact is going to be severe the longer this goes on. And so as people start losing their jobs and shortages start to become real and apparent, you're going to have increasing demands by politicians and the public on all sides for action. That always increases the risk that something precipitous will happen that could lead to violence. And if this escalates to violence, then who knows how far this is going to go. So we're trying to do everything we can to prevent that kind of escalation, but every single day is going to make it harder. Counseling patience, counseling negotiation will only get you so far if people are starting to really hurt.
Tanya, your take on where things stand on that line and as various entities try to grapple with the issues there.
Well, you know, I just have to say, too, what Susan said. I have to echo her on Andrew Scheer was unbelievable. I mean, check your privilege. That was so insulting, and it really shows that he has actually no idea what he's talking about. I mean, he's saying, you know, check your privilege from a guy that lives in a house that's funded by taxpayers, and didn't the party pay for his private school education for his kids? I mean, check your privilege. But that's, you know, it's really sad, though, too.
Tanya, I just wanted to, the pushback on that would be that he was addressing activists who were not necessarily Indigenous, although that's a fine line. And the money provided came from the party to pay for his school, but there are tax breaks associated with that. But just so we're clear and we don't get tweeted to death.
This is
carry
true.
on.
But you know, but this is true though. You know, it's like, well, what kind of message does that send? And you know, we're seeing this really interesting discourse now happening across Canada, where people are coming up with these statements, and you know, we're seeing sort of blind racism come out as well with what people are saying about what's happening at the blockades. You know, negotiation is the only way forward here, and I think all Canadians want and appreciate that. I think that what's happening with the blockade at Tyendinaga it's an example of, we need to show everyone that you must respect the laws of this country, and you also must respect your own Section 35 part of the Constitution that talks about Delgamuukw, that talks about actually Wet'suwet'en, the hereditary chiefs that are there do have Aboriginal rights and title over that land. And it's time to start listening to that and start paying attention to the law. And you'll see these blockades over and over again because people are tired of constantly being treated as the other. Is constantly be treated as not as important, and our interests are not being taken as seriously. And I think actually that Mark Miller is doing the right thing. You do negotiations. You ask for a peaceful end to this. There is no other way to do this. And you know what? People are waiting. You should wait. Be inconvenienced for a little bit more.
Tasha, your take on this.
Andrew Scheer, there's no excuse. I mean, no one can really understand why he chose to make those comments. I heard what you said, but still, he should have known better than to say them because they were inflammatory. With respect to the larger issue, though, because I do agree at this point, no one wants another Oka, no one wants another situation like Ipperwash, God forbid. But at the same time, the law isn't settled. This is part of the problem. Delgamuukw did not definitively establish the territorial right. The problem with BC is that there were no treaties, or most of it was not covered by treaties, so you do have a situation where land claims have to be established. And while Delgamuukw did set out parameters for establishing land claims, including oral tradition and other things, the land claim itself has not been settled. And the result is you do have a community that is divided between representation by traditional means on this territory as yet unproven in Canadian law, and also you have an elected band council where you have most of the nation of Wet'suwet'en who voted for the people who approved this pipeline. So you have a division within the community. That division has to be resolved by the community. But the larger land claim issue also has to be settled in the courts or through negotiation, and that has not been done, and that is one of the problems. So all the people who are across the country in solidarity, I believe many of them, their heart's in the right place, but others, you've got people coming out and saying this is a pipeline issue, this is about the environment. This is not. This is about First Nations governance, and that is an issue that the federal government has ignored for a very long time, has not properly dealt with, and now we are seeing the results of that is this frustration and anger that's boiling over. And John's right, it's boiling over on one side. Let's hope it does not boil over on the other as well.
There has been a lot of discussion, a lot of groups coming forward, those, of course, and what industry in this country doesn't rely on one extent or another to rail travel or rail transit in this country. Passengers so far seem to be okay with it, understanding what's going on, but do we think that the wider Canadian public does have an understanding of the issues that the Indigenous people are arguing about in this case? John?
I think that overall, generally, most Canadians believe that the federal government, from the time of the founding of this country up until today, has mistreated, sometimes grievously and abused, the rights of First Nations and other Indigenous Canadians. You don't have to get very deep into Section 35 and Supreme Court rulings and hereditary chiefs versus elected chiefs to get that kind of general consensus. That said, there's also a general consensus that people shouldn't be allowed to flout the law. And if there's a court injunction and the court injunction is not being enforced with good reason, because previous efforts such as Ipperwash and such as Oka led to a police officer being killed, led to a native protester being killed. We don't want people being killed. But it's not inconvenience, folks. Please stop calling it inconvenience. If we start to see genuine shortages, if we start to see people being laid off, if we start to see thousands of railway workers without a job, and then the suppliers laying off their people, if we start to see serious consequences in terms of the impact on the federal finances, it's not an inconvenience. This group of protesters in Belleville is doing serious harm to the Canadian economy.
But John, you also have to look at the fact, too, that First Nations people in this country don't have water, don't have clean running water and sewage. You know, we have still issues where we're talking too as well about unsafe housing. We don't have high schools for our children in our communities. Don't talk about, you know, the fact that this will happen to the economy further down the line. We have a segment of the population that has been without and has been left out of the economy for 150 years, if you look at it that way. So it's not, you know, it's not just about the economy here. This is about the future of this country, what we're seeing play out at the blockades and also too at Wet'suwet'en. And, you know, we also talk about something called the rule of law. That was really interesting when that was brought up, because who's been living by the rule of law and whose law is it? And this is a law that has been imposed on First Nations people, not something that we asked for as well.
And by contrast, Jason Kenney is allowing a lot of, you know, oil companies, distressed oil companies in Alberta, to walk away from their obligations to municipalities having to do with these orphaned wells. I mean, you know, the law has to be applied evenly to be respected. To follow up on what Tasha was saying too, I mean, this is a complex, multi-layered, incredibly delicate situation, and it does have to do with the pipeline. But I think the reason it's resonating, and I think the reason that this relatively small group of 5,000 people in a remote part of northern BC have got so much support in the rest of Canada, is because a lot of people see it as a continuation of the colonialism that brought us to this sad past today. And
because it is.
Because it is, and
it
because there has been education of the broader public, I think, in the last 5-10 years. I give credit to the federal government for some of that, for awakening people's awareness. I also am not pessimistic about an outcome. I do think, because, you know, some of the hereditary chiefs in the beginning were willing to negotiate the route of this gas pipeline. I don't think they're inalterably opposed to a pipeline across their territory. I mean, most of them aren't. So there is a possible way forward.
Tasha, I want to get you in on this.
Yeah, I wanted to address some of the points Tanya made about the imposition of the band council or elected government form, which did take place. It was an imposition through the Indian Act, which is a piece of legislation that I think everyone wants to get beyond, because it is not serving the interests of Indigenous Canadians, it is not serving the interests of Ottawa, it's not serving the interests of Canadians, period. And the issue, one of the fundamental issues here, is that you do have a clash of legal systems and worldviews. And you look at the Indian Act and you look at the elected council, you have about 10% of bands across the country, or nations across the country, that have chosen to revert to a traditional model of chiefs, of traditional chiefs, hereditary chiefs. But not every band or nation wants to do this. And I think that has to be decided by them, but it has to be decided, because the difficulty for a company like Coastal Gas is when you do negotiate, and they did negotiate with the 20 nations that were affected by the proposed pipeline, they did the negotiations that they believed were the ones that had to be done. Consultations were extensive, according to people in the Wet'suwet'en community. The reports that have been made on, you know, that said that a lot of consultations were held. In fact, some of the hereditary chiefs ran for band council, didn't get elected. So there's a lot of internal issues that have to be worked out here, and that is the conversation that has to be had with other levels of government as well, i.e. what form would Aboriginal or Indigenous self-government look like, you know, what responsibilities the province, the federal government. I mean, Justin Trudeau is kind of MIA in this. Late to the party is, I think, an understatement. I think he has to show some leadership. It's great that Mark Miller has gone to speak to the barricades at Thayendanegea, but the fact that the Prime Minister was not even in the country, did not even see fit, because this is a crisis. John is right. It's not just inconvenience. There's going to be shortages of chlorine for drinking water. There's going to be shortages of a lot of things. And I know that there's 60 boil water advisories currently in First Nations communities across the country, and that is inexcusable. But inconveniencing the entire country is not going to help settle the root issues here and move forward.
John, I sensed just before the break you had something to say to all of this.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's very hard to stay focused on the issue because it quickly spirals into climate change and economic development and who do we support elected chiefs or do we support hereditary chiefs? My own personal inclination, strong inclination, is to support those First Nations who want what everybody on this panel has, which is a middle-class existence, good education, a decent income, reasonable accommodation. These are the things that the pipeline was promising to deliver to people who currently lack it. But in this case, it doesn't really matter what I think. What I think is irrelevant. What matters is that we avoid the kind of escalation of conflict that radicals on both sides are seeking. There are people within the Indigenous community, there are environmental activists, and there are also on the other side, I think, people who are essentially racists, who want to provoke a confrontation in which it really does become who governs Canada, who's in charge of this economy, where does the rule of law begin and end, what are the roles of the police forces and federal and provincial politicians. If it escalates to that level, then there will be violence and there will be confrontation, and the Indigenous Canadians will lose. They do not have the numbers, they do not have the law on their side. They will lose, and that is why, for their sake, we have to prevent this from escalating any further.
Well, I agree with John that this is the community's issue to resolve. But that being said, I would like to know more about these agreements, these financial benefits that they're supposed to be getting from this pipeline. I mean, the construction period is, what, 2 years or something? Pipelines don't require a lot of staff to keep them going. So presumably some Indigenous people living up there will get short-term jobs. But really, and other bands have negotiated financial cash settlements, all to the good, but it doesn't sound to me like a lasting solution to the many problems of essentially trying to sustain yourself and have, as John says, a middle-class life in places like that. I'm not sure that I don't really see that as a win. But again, I'm very far away and I'm not there, and I don't presume to pontificate about it. I'm just wondering.
Hey, John, we are not going to lose if we have the majority of Canadians behind us, and if this country actually gets the political will behind it to look at what's been happening over the last 150 years and to turn the ship around. You know, what does it take to grow healthy children in this country? Clean water for everyone, safe housing, education, access to a doctor. This is not rocket science, but yet we have 2 tiers of citizenship in this country. And so if the political will of Canada gets behind changing how things are, then we're not going to see violence. Then we're going to see a better country for all of our children. We need to get to the root causes that we've been ignoring in this country for the last 150 years. It's time to actually stare at it, get to it, and make this a better place. And just getting back to what Tasha was saying as well, the elected band councils, those 20 elected band councils that we were talking about, they have a very small jurisdiction. They're reserved territory. We're talking about the territory outside of that. That is as well the unceded territory. That is the traditional territory of the people, and that is what the hereditary chiefs have access to and also to have protectionship over.
But that land claim has not been proved. I agree with you. That is what they say they do. But there's a subsequent case that, in British Columbia that did establish for another nation the right to the territory. But the implication of that, because Delgamuukw was not clear, I agree with you. There has
no,
to be
it
established.
is not clear, but what we're seeing, though, is an interpretation of it. And as you know, isn't the interpretation been like this for the last, I don't know, since 1997? That this but it has been. And doesn't that mean that length of it mean that that's the way that that law is going? And under Section 35 of the Constitution, this is how it should be read. And so
that's your interpretation, though. It hasn't been put to a court. With respect, I think no, but with respect, I think well, it should be. I agree. I'm not saying mine is correct. I am saying a court should judge this, because this is one of the issues, is that there are not treaties in BC, as everyone knows, and this is one of the issues that is dealing with this sort of vacuum of legal title to the land. And I agree. Let's deal with it.
If we can get away just for a minute, and let me put just one last little oar in. There is will, I believe, goodwill on the part of all Canadians to find a path forward for reconciliation with First Nations. Though, frankly, I don't know what that path is. I think that many politicians and leaders of goodwill on both sides have tried and failed to find that path. But the will is there. But if protests escalate, if blockades escalate, if economic damage escalates, you will lose that goodwill, Tanya. And one final statistic. There were more people who came into Canada last year as immigrants than all the First Nations living on reserve in the country today. They are not part of this fight. They do not see themselves as part of this fight. And every single year, the demographics work against the First Nations.
But you know what they are, though, because they are living on our land, you know, and we're all here now, and we all have to figure this out. And we are on uncharted territories, perhaps. You know, yes, everybody wants reconciliation. Now, I've never agreed with that word, and it's actually kind of interesting. I remember sitting here a year ago talking about reconciliation being dead. And why? Because what was happening last January at Wet'suwet'en, you know, reconciliation at the end of the gun with the RCMP. You cannot do that. When you have the RCMP even ignoring Section 35 of the Constitution, you can't do this on this land. You must negotiate, and I think that we will get there, but we need to change how things have been happening and how things are going. We can do this.
Guys, I want to thank you so much for some really thoughtful conversation. Perhaps, unfortunately, a conversation we're going to have many more times, but I hope Canadians got as much out of it as I did. As always, though, we want to get you involved in the debate. You can tweet me at jnorthcottcbc. Just remember to use the hashtag SundayScrum. Our panelists, as you can tell, always up for a good discussion, and they can be reached at Susan_P_Riley, at John Ibbotson, at Tanya Talaga, and at Tasha Carradine. I want to thank all of you. Freelance columnist Susan Riley, thank you.
Thanks, John.
John Ibbotson of the Globe and Mail.
Thank you, John.
Author and journalist Tanya Talaga. Thanks again, Tanya.
Miigwech.
And CEO of Ellipsum Public Affairs, Tasha Carradine. Thanks, Tasha.
Thank you, John.